All right. In July, I was moderating a course in Vegas, and Bill was on the panel, and he mentioned to me, he says, you know, some of these ideas of comparing fat transfer to hair transfers or hair grafts was an interesting idea. So I've always touched upon it in my lectures, but I decided to go ahead and flesh out this idea more in depth because I think there's a lot of similarities. And with those similarities, I think there's going to be some very good educational value, whether you're just starting out in fat transfers or whether you're mature in the practice. So this is going to be more about thinking, but thinking is something very, very important because without thinking, you're not going to be able to do the strategies. I think you've heard about an hour and a half of technique. I want to go through more sort of just general thinking process. So how did I come to this thought? Well, about 40% of my business is fat transfer and about 40% of my business is hair restoration. So with those two modalities that I have, I started to see the similarities. You know, what are the similarities and why is that so important? Well, first of all, they're both free grafts. They're grafts taken from the back of the head, for example, for hair, and moved to the front. They're free grafts. They're not sewn in. There's no microvascular connection to it. And then they're placed in a different region. And then there's different influences that occur when that graft is transplanted. Well, what happens with fat grafting? To me, it's very, very similar. And when you begin to understand it contextually from a perspective of hair transplantation, I think you can better educate your patients about the longevity of fat grafting, the evolution of changes with fat grafting, the nature of fat grafting. And I think those are very, very important because there's a lot of mythology that's surrounding a fat transfer. So hopefully this idea is going to be clearer as we proceed. So it started with this. I was studying for my hair boards, and I was looking at Unger's book on hair transplant, and I started to think about, oh, hair grafts grow from about 6 months to a year. Well, why is that? The answer is actually a simple thing. It's blood supply, and it goes through the periods of primary inoculation, secondary inoculation, all the way to neovascularization. But hair grafts don't grow consistently at 6 to 12 months. Sometimes they grow at 9 months, sometimes they grow at 6 months. I've had some people grow at 4 months, some people grow at 12 months. And there's this process of blood supply as it starts to mature that leads to the growth of a graft. So does that occur in fat grafting? And I really believe it does. So how does hair grow? Very simple. You start with the preoperative levels and you grow to a result over a period of about 6 months to 18 months with variable growth during that time until the hair result matures. And then what happens after that, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, you lose more hair. You just lose a little more hair. But what do you lose? Do you lose the transplanted hairs? No, if you take it from a safe donor area, we'll talk about that in a moment, you don't lose that hair, you lose the surrounding hair. So this model is very, very adaptable to understand fat grafting. The only difference is when you put fat in, there's a lot of volume instantaneously. So that looks like a result. But as everyone knows, there's edema, there's fat cells that may be engorged, that may be smaller than they are, larger than they are. Whatever it may be, there's an element that looks like a result very early on. And then what happens, I think, is a lot of people go through the first 3 months and go, well, the fat grafting went away and it's gone. Well, is that the case? No, you're seeing these long-term results years out. And if that's the case, why does fat grafting last? Is it, is it permanent? And the answer really, it is permanent. And so that's a good and a bad thing, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So the concept is there's a period of time when the fat doesn't look as good. When is that time? Is it exactly at 3 months around? That's what I've always thought, but I've matured my thinking to say, well, there's variability with the period of time when hair is beginning to grow, and there's variable times when fat begins to grow. And that fat does mature, it does improve. If you look at your results at 7, 8 months, then maybe 12 months and 18 months, I encourage you to follow your results. You will see in most cases ongoing improvements for some reason. And there's many ways to look at that. I'll give you different philosophical perspectives as we continue. But then what happens is a few years later, does the fat just go away? I've heard patients come to me and say, oh, the fat graft lasts 10 years. If it has blood supply and it's there, if you put a microvascular free flap, is it just going to die 10 years later? No, if it has blood supply, it's going to survive. That makes no sense. What's happening is further aging and further loss of fat. So that's essentially what's happening when people are getting older down the road. So there's a period of time where it's swollen, it shrinks, and then the fat cells improve. So let's get some examples here. Here's a 40-year-old lady at a week, pretty puffy, bruised, but not too puffy because she's younger, she needs less fat. And then at about 3 months, if you look at this, it's pretty unimpressive. If you were not really following your cases and discharge your patient, you would say, well, it's over. That's it, it's gone. But if you wait for her and she's out of town, so I didn't see her until about a year, She looks better, not perfect. There's still some tear troughs. There's areas that are not perfect. Fat doesn't fix everything. But she looks softer, she looks better, and there's something about that change over a period of a year without gaining weight or anything else, very stable, that she looks better. So what is that? Here's another example. This is a lady, 48 years old. This is a week out, okay? The only thing else she had was Botox over that period of time. And then if you look at her at a month, still a little full, okay? I needed a lot more fat in her face. And then about 3 months out, it's about right. But if you see what's actually happening here is she's starting to become a little hollower at 6 months. There's a little bit delayed dip, if you will. There's a little bit of a delayed time period when it's coming down. And then it gets to be a little bit better over a period of time, about 11 months. And then at 15 months, there's a better result. There's a softness there. And that change is occurring over a period of about 12 to 18 months. Here's a lady here. I'm sorry, the quality of slides are not very clear on this. If you look at this, this is all on my website too. It's much easier to see it. At 1 month, you can see she looks pretty good, maybe a little bit full, okay? And then if we go to about 3 months, there's no dip in the classic period of time that I conceive of the dip. And then as you go forward with it, 9 months, it looks like it's going away. Okay, looks like, okay, here it is. It's definitely going away. But if you just sort of follow it, with all things being equal, at a year, it's starting to build forward. You start to see it again. And then you see it forward about 2 years out, it's starting to build again. And this is with no additional fillers or fat or anything else. In fact, I only saw her during these intervals, and she lives about 2 hours away from Dallas. So it gives you a concept that maybe something is changing over time. And if you begin to understand it like a hair graft, perhaps there's a different way of thinking about it. So grafts are permanent like a tattoo. And if it's permanent, you've got to think about safety too. So we talked about efficacy and evolution, but how about we talk about, is it safe? Is fat grafting safe? Well, I really like to use analogy of age. Age is safety. Think about this. If you don't know the world of hair restoration, if you've got a 20-year-old gentleman coming to you for a hair transplant, he's not necessarily very safe because he's going to change over his lifetime, and his change is going to be hair loss, and there's going to be an evolution of change. Well, fat grafting has a different risk. If you put fat into someone very young, there's a risk of metabolic changes over that lifetime with weight gain and other things that may occur. So I always caution my patients with childbirth, with aging, metabolic changes that occur over a lifetime to be very cognizant of those changes and to be very careful. So I think that element of age in very young people for fat grafting carries some degree of risk over that lifetime because it's a permanent filler, because if we go with the idea, if we understand and believe the idea that this is permanent, then we have to take that attribution and move it forward over their lifetime. And so we got to be careful. There's one caveat though. I think that fat has an element of safety, unlike hair, because it is different. Hair, you lose more hair around it and there's a problem. Fat, I'm not worried about it losing more fat around it. I'm worried about their gaining more weight over that time. But the safety factor built into fat over a lifetime is twofold. One is the fact they're going to continue to lose fat. So hopefully that fat that you're keeping there will be buttressed against actually weight or volume loss in those areas. The second thing is the fact that when you're young, you don't need much fat. So very, very little fat is put in. So I think there's a couple safety mechanisms, but these are things that I communicate with my patients on the front end so that they understand where I'm thinking about long-term safety during the consultation period. So hair loss, what's ideal amount of hair? A lot, right? There's very few people that would say I have too much hair. And so ideal is a ton of hair. That's it, youth. But is a ton of fat ideal? No, a ton of fat, sometimes there's too much baby fat. And most women like their face closer to the early 30s. So there may be something less ideal with too much robust fat. So the goal is, in my opinion, is to understand that hair, too little hair is the risk when you deliver that as a result. But in my opinion, what's a risk is not too little fat, it's too much fat. And so you got to be really careful with this. And that's the one major safety valve that I think about when we talked about aging and them gaining weight over time. So let's talk a little bit more about that in a moment here. So I like this model of understanding a glass of water emptying. So if you're full in youth and you continue to lose volume as you mature, you just fill it up the right amount based on how much loss you have. But it doesn't stop the hollowing or the emptying of the glass, and you have to tank it up maybe every few years to 10 years or so. So this is another concept, donor dominance. Donor dominance was started in the 1950s by a New York dermatologist by the name of Norman Ornschreich, who found that hairs moved from the back of the head to the front of the head would behave exactly like the hairs on the back of the head. Because if you think of the baldest man, he's still got a fringe of hair on the back of the head, unless he shaves it off. And that hair moved to the front is genetically programmed not to be lost, and it won't be lost. So are there donor dominance influences